Welcome back to the IEA's podcast Everything Energy. I'm Dan Hewitt. What are today's big challenges to energy security? That was a key question that energy ministers and top officials from over 50 countries tried to answer at the IEA's ministerial meeting in Paris. Traditional risks to energy systems remain, but new ones are evolving too, from critical minerals and technological supply chain disruptions to extreme weather events. Reflecting on that, here's the IEA Executive Director, Fatih Birol.
We are broadening the definition of energy security. Oil security remains still main preoccupation of the IEA, but we have now also natural gas security. Electricity security has been discussed a lot, given the recent attacks, cyber attacks on the electricity infrastructure. But we have also discussed, and our countries gave us a special mandate on working on critical minerals and supply chains security.
The solution to these problems are evolving. But is change happening fast enough, and is it moving in the right direction? To help unpack these questions, we spoke to two energy ministers, Singapore's Tan See Ling and Morocco's Leila Ben Ali. We spoke to them at the ministerial meeting and then sat down with the IEA's chief energy economist, Tim Gould. OK, Minister Tan, thanks for joining us. Now, just from Singapore's perspective, what does ensuring energy security mean today?
Well, for us, I think you know the size of our country, and we're at a crossroads really between Asia and also Europe itself. But given the size, we are extremely disadvantaged when it comes to natural resources and energy for that matter. So I think it's no surprise that for us, we import almost all of our energy needs, and really at this point in time, they're in the form of natural gas itself. So for us, the energy security is paramount to us. So for how we look at it is that we have to ensure that our supply, particularly our supply chains itself, do not in any way get affected. So we embarked on a diversification strategy where we don't just procure gas itself from one source, we buy them from all over the world today. On top of that, for the grid, we continue to maintain grid resilience. So we spent a lot of resources upgrading the grid, enhancing the grid to make sure that it's fit for purpose. And to that end, with the rising energy needs, particularly with regards to data centers, semiconductors, we find that when we embark on energy transition, the main thing that we wanted to make sure that we don't ever drop the ball is the dealing with intermittency. And so as a result of that, what we have done is that we've also invested significantly in developing a digital twin that gives us the ability to enhance our monitoring, making a lot more precise forecasting, and also making sure that we can actually simulate different scenarios where there are peaks and troughs, and making sure that we don't get compromised in any way.
Could you tell us more about some of the specific threats today, whether it's extreme weather, cyber attacks, other shocks? What is Singapore doing to strengthen its resilience of its energy infrastructure right now?
So for us, the key focus for us is making sure that our grid resilience is protected at all costs. So we have a lot of initiatives that is focused at making sure that we continue to constantly upgrade and invest in our grid, making sure that it is protected against potential physical threats or even cyber type of threats itself, both from within and from without. Now, beyond that, we are now working with our regional neighbors, working with them where they have got significant resources, natural resources for renewable energy. So what we have done is working with IEA, working with many other agencies to bring the ASEAN power grid into a reality.
Now, you mentioned international organisations. Maybe you could just tell us how important international cooperation is for Singapore's energy security.
It is quintessential. In fact, because of the fact that we are all plugged in globally, no one country can be an island unto itself when it comes to their own energy needs. In fact, today, for every country in the world, energy is existential for all of us. in some countries like mine, for instance, where even our drinking water it comes from the sea, it comes from the rivers and so on. We go through desalination, the purification of the water requires energy. On top of that, with the rapid rise in artificial intelligence, in the deployment of data centers and advanced packaging, semiconductor development, I think that energy needs is going to be insatiable.
Okay, so I'm joined by Leila Bernardi, and I just want to start by asking you what energy security means for your country. What does energy security mean for you right now?
Well, thank you, Dan, for this very, very important and timely question. And you can already see that the flavor and the definition of energy security, it is changing. People are very now pushed to think about, because of the climate change issues, because we've been having terrible micro floods and macro floods in Morocco over the last few weeks, totally changing the way we plan energy infrastructure, totally changing the way we view energy security. And also, I think another aspect is people are linking it more and more to affordability, because when you have companies or factories being obliged to shut down because they don't have access to energy, or their access to energy is being compromised, that's raising very deep social issues in the country, regardless of the country. I think from my perspective, and from the perspective of Morocco, I think there are two aspects that I would want to really insist on. Is first, we are in 21st century, and we are really pushing to get the investment in infrastructure being done so that the infrastructure is resilient to cyber threats, to cyber attacks, to new type of threats that the energy infrastructure is being affected with. And the second aspect that we want to insist on is Morocco has this great potential, exceptional potential of renewable energy, and it has a very diversified mix of energy. Now, it takes two to tango. That's what I always tell my colleagues. So if you want to increase our connectivity between Morocco, the rest of Africa, and Europe, to increase our energy security together, increase that mutual dependence, we definitely have to invest in more and more energy infrastructure, more cables, more pipelines, to really increase that energy security and mutual dependence between us.
Okay, well, you mentioned some of the challenges there. Just wondering if we could talk about how those challenges have evolved. What do you think is the single biggest threat to energy security today?
So I think the biggest challenge and threat today is the inability of the energy industry, to reinvent itself fast. It's always, we always compare it to a VLCC. It's a big ship that is very difficult to change because you have those heavy investments that you have to amortize over 30 years. Of course, it's always difficult to have new technologies coming in, but we have to admit that the utilization of artificial intelligence today in grids is very important. It's key. It's critical. The higher utilization of renewable energy in those systems, the utilization of batteries and storage, where costs have declined dramatically over the last few years. So I think all those aspects now are obliging the industry to reinvent itself. And I think the biggest threat to us is the celerity, or how fast our incumbents, our system operators, the way we plan our energy systems is going to change as well, as the same pace, as fast as the technology is changing.
Tim Gold, thank you for joining us today. Now, look, there's a really sharp focus on energy security right now, and I think it's worth reflecting on why and the things that have pushed it up the political agenda.
Well, thanks a lot, Dan. As you know, for us at the International Energy Agency, energy security is a sort of constant preoccupation. It's the founding mandate for the International Energy Agency. But it's undoubtedly true that it's risen sharply up the policy agenda in recent years. And I think one of the key events that did that was Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent cut to Russia's pipeline deliveries to Europe, and what that meant for gas prices in Europe and around the world, and also for electricity prices, because gas tends to set in many markets also the wholesale electricity price. So that's refocused a lot of political attention on risks to energy security, because clearly Europe got itself in a position where it was vulnerable. It was too dependent on a single source of gas. And that's led people to look for other potential vulnerabilities, because there are some which are in different parts of the energy sector. And one that we focused on a lot is the dependence we have on technologies, on critical minerals from single sources. And the most, I think, stark dependence there is the dependence on a single supplier, China, for many of the critical minerals, the rare earth elements, the battery metals, and so on, that are increasingly important inputs into clean technology manufacturing around the world. So that's been a really big focus for the IEA as well. There are new issues in the electricity sector. There's new issues also to do with the sort of resilience of energy infrastructure in the face of increasing strains also from extreme weather events. But I think there's one other bit of context which the executive director has also been keen for people to understand. It's just that we are now living in a dangerous world, in a world of conflict, of rivalry, of fragmentation to a degree. And that also puts additional strains on the system. And that's why we spoke in the World Energy Outlook last year about energy security being sort of elevated to a key issue of economic security and national security.
Okay, so there's a really interesting interplay between maybe the traditional concerns about stockpiling things like oil and some of those newer ideas you mentioned. Maybe we could talk about one of them, critical minerals. Talk to us about how important critical minerals are to energy security and perhaps the broader issue about stockpiling and whether that's happening in the right way or happening fast enough.
So critical minerals, as I mentioned, they're important inputs, not just into energy technologies, but also into all sorts of areas of modern dynamic economies. They're important for AI and data centers. They're important for aerospace. They're important for the automobile industry. They're important for the defense industry. So you can see that, that energy security vulnerability that we identified is actually one that has implications really across the wider economy. The key issue there is market concentration. That's one that we've highlighted in our analysis. And one of the ways that you deal with those risks, and in the long term, it's the only way to deal with that risk, is to create more diversified and resilient supply chains. But in the short term, when you're looking at how you manage disruptions, stockpiling can be an important way, in a sense, an important buffer that can provide you some protection in the event of adverse circumstances, and that could be deliberate, it could be related to a weather event or other disruption to supply. So stockpiling is an important part of our analytical work. It's an important part of the work that we do with our member countries through the Critical Minerals Security Program. And of course, we have a lot of experience in that because of the way that we coordinate the stocks of oil, which come into play in the event of a disruption in that sector. But critical minerals are very different from oil markets. Each of those individual markets for different strategic minerals has its own specificity. Each of them has different sort of constraints on how you could warehouse stuff, how you might buy it, how you might release it to the market, how long you can keep it, in what conditions. And we're not saying that stockpiling is a sort of silver bullet for security in all those areas. So there needs to be quite a differentiated discussion about how you manage that across different strategic minerals. We're very much part of that discussion. And I think you can see in many of our member countries around the world that is a very active discussion about how to manage building up those stockpiles in certain areas. And indeed, in some countries, like Japan and Korea, they have long experience of managing those stockpiles already because of earlier disruptions to supply that they reacted to in the last 10 or 15 years.
I want to pick up on another challenge, and that's the challenge of cyber attacks. Can you put into context for us the scale of the challenge that poses to energy systems, but also energy security as well?
So the incidence of cyber attacks has increased sharply in recent years. And it's one of the elements in play when you talk about a modern agenda for electricity security. Because as listeners to this podcast will no doubt be aware, the IEA is focusing on the age of electricity, this notion that when we have incremental need for energy services, electricity seems to be the first thing we're turning to meet that. So electricity demand is rising much more quickly than overall energy demand. But one of the really interesting reflections from the ministerial meeting that we've just come out of was, you can't just think about your electricity system in the same way that you've thought about it in the past. In the past, you had a very centralized system with electricity flows tending to be from large generation units out to the consumer. Now you have much more bidirectional flows because you have a lot more decentralized sources of generation. You have a lot of new technologies coming into the system on the generation side, some of which, like solar and wind, are intermittent. And you have these new security threats, which include cyber attacks, but also some of the other things we've seen where there have been dangers. There have been threats to, for instance, subsea cables and other bits of electricity infrastructure. So one of the things we're very keen on now at the IEA is to have a broad discussion about what a modern approach to electricity security involves. And that's the infrastructure components, that's the generation, that's the supply side, that's also demand side flexibility, and how that all ties together in a modern approach to security in that sector.
Okay, I want to pick up with something you mentioned in your first answer, and that's the situation in Ukraine. I wonder if you can reflect about how the world has responded to the energy challenge that has arisen from this war between Russia and Ukraine.
So I think there's different dimensions to that. And I think the first thing that we heard a lot about at the ministerial is just the response to, the human suffering that has been caused by that deliberate targeting of energy infrastructure by Russia in Ukraine. And it's been a particularly harsh winter this year. And you've seen that's had really extraordinary implications then for people's lives in Ukraine. There's been a lot of support coming from IEA member countries to Ukraine's electricity sector, to the energy sector as a whole. But I think there's some important learnings that we can take also from the way that Ukraine has responded, because it's had to, in a sense, in real time, think through some quite profound things about the resilience of its energy infrastructure and its electricity infrastructure. And that ranges from elements of the physical protection of critical assets. So how do you protect transformers, for example, against attack? And there's various elements of providing physical protection for that, maybe moving some elements of that underground where you can. There's important elements of emergency preparedness, how you get stuff back up and running as quickly as possible. How do you build resilience into your energy planning as a sort of first principle? But I think one of the areas that Ukraine has thought deeply about now and has had to sort of react on the hoof to try and implement is to move away from that highly centralized system that it inherited from the Soviet Union, both for electricity and also for heat. There's a big component of district heating in the Ukrainian energy system, and how you think about decentralizing that, and what are the security benefits that come from a more decentralized setup of an energy system. Because by its nature, a more distributed system is less easy to target. It's less easy to take down. It can be easier to bring back into operation. And I think there's some very useful things that we can think about more broadly on energy security from that way that you've have a more decentralized, distributed view of a system in the way that Ukraine is thinking about under the most difficult circumstances.
Okay, well, we've mentioned some of the traditional challenges that are still there, but let's just turn again to one of the newer challenges, I'll call it, and that's extreme weather events. And I think it's just worth talking about how has that risen up the energy security agenda, but also maybe you could talk to us about the resilience of things like grids. How is progress coming along to make sure that energy systems can withstand the challenges posed by extreme weather?
There's a number of different dimensions to it. And one of the things that we did in the last year's World Energy Outlook was try to put together a picture of how many disruptions there have been because of those kinds of extreme weather events, which bits of the system have proved to be most vulnerable, what are the key risks involved, and then what also are the sorts of things that policymakers need to be thinking about. And the sad fact is these are an increasingly apparent source of vulnerability for many households who rely on electricity, who suffer from interruptions to supply as a result. A lot of them have to do with electricity infrastructure, so transmission and distribution grids that can be affected by extreme winds. But I think the thing that we need to watch out for in the future is the effect of heat, because heat has multiple implications for an energy system. Of course, it pushes up your cooling demand. That can be a big component of your peak electricity demand. It can introduce huge strains on a system if you have a prolonged period of extreme heat. And that then also has implications for the way that you distribute the electricity. It reduces the efficiency of your networks. It can affect the operation of some of your generation assets. So extreme heat, somewhat counterintuitively, has a downgrading effect on the electricity production from solar panels, for example. It can reduce the availability of water for cooling of thermal plants. So you have all these cascading impacts from heat waves that can be a real source of vulnerability. So thinking through how you site assets, how you protect assets, how you manage your electricity infrastructure is an increasingly important component of that modern approach to electricity security. And there's that goes all the way from the demand side through appliance efficiency through to some really sort of physical implications for how you look at some of the infrastructure.
Okay, well, we've spoken about lots of solutions to the issues you've raised, but if we just take a step back, are there some consistent fundamentals about the way that we can tackle some of these big issues about energy security?
Back at the London meeting on the future of energy security, our executive director tried to answer that question, and he came up with what he called his 3 golden rules for energy security. And I think they provide a really helpful framing for the way that you could think about the response to these challenges. The first of those is diversification. We've seen numerous examples in energy history of how overextending your reliance on a single route or a single supplier or indeed a single source of energy, a single technology, can bring vulnerabilities to the system. So diversification in all of its sort of manifestations, I think, is a really important guiding principle for how you think about security in the modern energy world. A second principle he talked about is predictability, because in the end, a lot of the ways that we shape our ability to respond to security issues come back to investment, and investment will only come where there is a predictable framework in place for guiding those capital flows into different kinds of energy projects. So that predictability of that system, also from an investment perspective, is a really important component of long-term security. And a third one is international cooperation, there's so much to be gained from working together to resolve some of these issues. And I think the IEA is a perfect example of that, the way that collective response to oil security issues has helped provide a safety net for oil markets over the 52 years since the IEA was founded, but also how collective responses to other issues in the energy sector, including now critical minerals, but also that emerging set of issues for the electricity sector and also for natural gas, how there is great benefit to be had for acting in concert and providing a forum for exchange of the best ideas on dealing with some of these issues.
That's great. Well, Tim Gold, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Always a pleasure, Dan. Thanks so much.